Chapter 13. The Sun King. The Sun King of France. The white walls of France's royal palace glowed in the warm afternoon sunshine. The King of France, Louis VIII, was deep in a meeting with his ministers. The Queen was writing letters in her boudoir. Servants scurried through the corridors. Upstairs in the nursery, one maid scrubbed at the grass-stained clothes of the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. Another polished the little boy's silver-plated breakfast dishes. Down in the kitchen, the Dauphin's nurse was telling the cook to fix Flemish soup, egg yolks beaten with wine and salt, and then boiled, for the Dauphin's dinner. He'd been suffering from a slight cold, and she wanted him fed a proper invalid supper. Outside, the little boy himself wandered through the gardens alone. He was barely 4 years old, but somehow he had managed to escape from the palace without anyone noticing. He'd found a stick on the ground, and he poked at the grass along the path as he walked. Just ahead, a fountain bubbled down into a wide basin. The little boy bent over it, stirring the water with his stick. He leaned a little further over. His foot slipped. He fell into water that was over his head. If a passing peasant hadn't heard the sound of splashes and hauled him out, the Dauphin would have drowned. Not long after the little prince's swim, his father died. At the age of 4 years and 8 months, Louis IX was now the King of France. He was the lord of every French citizen and the master of every blade of French grass and clump of dirt. You see, the French king claimed to be the owner of the country he ruled. The French called their king a visible divinity, God's representative on earth. So while Charles II struggled to keep his throne, Louis IX ruled without opposition. His father and his father's minister, Cardinal Richelieu, had made France into one of the most powerful nations in Europe, and Louis IX was the most powerful man in this powerful nation. While he was still young, Louis's advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, ruled for him. Mazarin had been trained by Richelieu to rule with a ruthless and strict hand, demanding that every French citizen obey the word of the king without question. He continually reminded Louis that the king should be treated almost like a god. When Mazarin died, Louis announced that he would now rule absolutely, without a council of advisers. He would be his own first minister. His ministers were astounded. No French king had ruled without advisers for almost 100 years, and no one believed that this elegant young man, skilled at dancing and court life, would be an efficient ruler. But Louis himself knew what he wanted. In his memoirs he later wrote, "In my heart I prefer fame above all else, even life itself." For the next 50 years, Louis ruled as absolute King of France. He worked all day long, every day, wielding absolute control over every part of his reign. He chose the sun as his emblem to represent his power, and was called the Sun King by his courtiers. Only a nobleman of high rank was allowed to dry him after he had a bath. Other aristocrats fought over the privilege of handing Louis IX his shirt and pants as he dressed. Louis thought that this was a very proper relationship for a king to have with his subjects. In a letter to his son he wrote, "Letting your people lay down the law to you is the worst calamity that a man of our rank can suffer. When the people try to take power for themselves, the more you grant them, the more they want. The more favors you give to them, the more contempt they feel for you. And the ones who want power the most are always the stupidest." The Sun King needed a palace worthy of his greatness, so Louis IX decided to build a huge new house at Versailles, where a tiny hunting lodge stood. After almost 50 years of labor, this tiny hunting lodge had been transformed into an enormous palace, a quarter of a mile long. Canals were dug to bring water from the river and to drain the marshland. Versailles was full of elaborate rooms like the famous Hall of Mirrors, where 17 huge mirrors stood across from 17 large windows, and the Salon of Apollo, where a solid silver throne stood. Hundreds of statues of Greek gods such as Apollo, Jupiter, and Neptune stood in the gardens. Each god had Louis's face. Every night thousands of candles lit the palace into brilliance for balls, concerts, and floating parades held on the grand canal that ran through the grounds. To increase his power, Louis brought his noblemen to Versailles to live. He forced them to pay attention to court manners. The noblemen and women spent all of their time trying to please the king, rather than planning revolt. Noblemen would do whatever Louis asked, if it meant that they would receive a sign of his favor. Permission to wear clothing reserved for the king's favorites, a position standing a little closer to the front of the throne room, or a more ornate chair at a royal dinner. The Duc de Simon, who lived at Versailles for many years, wrote that Louis also encouraged his noblemen to spend money in order to make them more loyal. The king loved splendor, magnificence, and profusion in all things, the Duke remarked, and encouraged similar tastes in his court. To spend money freely on feasting, at cards, was a sure way to gain his favor, perhaps to obtain the honor of a word from him. By making expensive habits the fashion, and, for people in a certain position, a necessity, he compelled his courtiers to live beyond their income, and gradually reduced them to depend on his bounty for the means of subsistence. The Sun King spent most of his reign fighting wars to expand France's borders. During Louis's reign, France became the largest and most important nation in Europe. But in the last years of Louis's life, his army began to falter. Other European nations joined together to oppose the ambitious French king. France lost some of its new territory, and then Louis's son, the Dauphin, died suddenly of smallpox. Louis didn't mourn too much. He disliked his son, who was slothful and self-absorbed. He feared nothing more in this world than to become king, the Dauphin's aunt remarked tartly. He was frightfully lazy, could sit the whole long day on a bed. With the Dauphin's death, Louis's grandson became the new heir to the French crown, but not long after, the grandson's wife, a cheerful, affectionate girl, whom Louis IX loved like a daughter, began to complain of toothache. She didn't have a toothache. She had the measles. After a week of illness, she died. A few days later, her husband died as well. Then one of Louis's grandsons fell from a horse and was killed. Faced with so many catastrophes, Louis himself began to grow ill. One day he went hunting and came back looking exhausted, complaining about pain in his left leg. His doctors told him nothing was wrong, but the doctors had missed an infection, growing below Louis's knee. In just a few days, Louis was suffering from gangrene. When he died, his only remaining grandson, a sickly 5-year-old, inherited the throne of France. The Sun King had made himself a god on earth, but he had also made a great mistake. He had made himself powerful by forcing the common people of France to pay heavy taxes to support his wars and his lavish palaces. French peasants and craftsmen had labored for decades to build Versailles. One French aristocrat remarked that the hard work and swampy climate was so bad for the workmen that dead bodies of peasants had to be removed every morning. Thousands and thousands of Frenchmen had died in Louis's unending wars. And throughout the French countryside, anger was growing, anger which would eventually destroy the French crown forever.